Good afternoon. My name's Alastair Humphreys, and I wanted to be an adventurer. However, I was am a slightly weedy, unfit, wimpish person, not ideally suited to a life of adventure. I didn't have the necessary skills to go climb great mountains or do serious expeditions and adventures that I was dreaming of doing. I was completely skint, I had very, very little money, and I had absolutely no idea how to go about running or launching or organising any sort of adventure or expedition at all. And all of these, I think, are pretty valid reasons why I was not necessarily suited to go off and have adventures. They're pretty fair points, I felt. However, I also realised that deep down these were all slightly just excuses that I was making up inside myself just to stop me having to go and do the frightening thing of committing to something which was far scarier and more difficult than just my normal nice life, and also was probably setting me up for failing spectacularly and coming home looking like a total idiot. And I realised these were all the excuses that I was making. And then I thought that the only thing worse than me going off and doing something, failing and looking like an idiot, was for me not to do it and to get old and look back on my life and just really regret not having had a go at something like this. So I decided just to try and do something anyway. It struck me that you're not an expert at something when you begin it. If anything's worth doing, you're not going to be an expert at it at first. You're going to be rubbish at it. And the crucial thing I thought was just to try and find something I could do just to get me started. So I tried to have a think. I came up with the idea. I thought, I will cycle around the world, which is actually an idea that's far easier really than it might sound. Because if you can ride a bike and put up a tent and you're able to cycle for a day and put up your tent, then you have all of the skills and equipment necessary to cycle around the world. All you need after that is the sufficiently few brain cells to repeat that process enough times to get you all the way around the world. So I was very worried. I had all the worries that you might have about going to set off around the world, but I somehow persuaded myself to get on the bike, wave goodbye to my mum and dad, pedal off down the road and set off on my journey around the world. And when I set off, I'd never spent a night in a tent on my own before. So it was a pretty steep learning curve as I pedaled off down through England, crossed over to France, across Europe, through the Middle East, into Africa, all the way down Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean. I got the whole way around the world without using an aeroplane, from the bottom of Patagonia right the way to northern Alaska, over to Asia, and cycled right the way across Asia and back home again. The whole journey was 46,000 miles. I rode through 60 countries. I was away for 4 years and 3 months on this journey, and the entire trip around the world cost me less than £7,000. As I set off, I started to grow more and more and more into this experience. This picture's me arriving at the end of Africa, which is a wonderful moment on the journey for me, because I realised that all of my worries, I'd set off with so many worries about the world being a bad place, full of all the negative things that people always ask me about this journey. But the reality was, from my experience, that the world is generally a good place. Nearly everyone is a good person trying to get on in their life as best they could. So that was really uplifting for me on the journey. But what really encouraged me by the time I got to the end of Africa was this realization that I was capable of way more than I'd ever imagined. Having made it through Africa was such a boost for my confidence. I felt so grateful that I'd somehow persuaded myself just to begin this journey, because it really wasn't such a big deal once I was on the way. So from Africa, I kept on riding on for a bit longer, about a year and a half longer, up into the Yukon by now, where I came across this enormous forest fire, the size of Wales, with only one little road through this area. And the fire brigade said to me, there's no way you can carry on. By now I'd been cycling for about 3 years, and in those 3 years, the thing that struck me the most was you almost always come up against people who say no to you. It's the default setting. People say, oh no, you can't do that, you can't do that. It's so much easier to say no. And I've now had 3 years of having to just continually overcome this negativity of people, and also to try and trust myself a little bit, to try to, when you're on your own, you just have to make these decisions on your own as best as you possibly can, but you can't make perfect decisions on your own. You just have to make them as best you can and then trust yourself to follow through with them. So I thought, there must be some sort of way around here. My journey can't be over. So I had to think, I came up with an idea. I thought, I know, I'll borrow a canoe. So I borrowed a canoe, put the bike in a canoe and paddled down the Yukon River for 500 miles till I was past the fires, could get back onto the bike, and the journey continued on through the rest of the Americas and over into Siberia, into Asia, which is the last stage of the journey. Riding through Siberia was one of the most brutal experiences of my life. The temperature was down to minus 40 degrees Celsius and Fahrenheit, same at minus 40, and life at minus 40 is pretty brutal, especially with really bad equipment and never having done anything like this before. The whole world is frozen, still and silent. There's the silent, you don't hear anything at all. The view you see was just, I found, intimidatingly empty and bleak. There's no smells, it's so cold, the food doesn't taste of anything, you're just gobbling down half frozen stuff, you don't really care about taste, and the only thing that's left is a sensation of touch. When you touch metal, you freeze to it, this sort of terrifying sensation. You're bundled up in a sleeping bag with the cold burning through and freezing. You wake up in the morning, the ice tumbles off the tent down your neck. It's a pretty brutal and unpleasant experience. However, I persuaded myself to keep going, which is something I would never have imagined being able to do before I started this trip. By now I'd had so many difficult experiences, but I'd come to be able to thrive just on retrospective pleasures. So to persuade myself to keep persevering through all the misery, because when you get to the end, and I eventually got back home to Yorkshire, the cup of tea that you get at the end is all the sweeter for having persevered through 3 months of Siberia. This is a slightly ridiculous picture of the books that I took through that journey in Siberia, which is probably means it's time for me to move to a Kindle, but I'm a bit of a Luddite, but I love books and reading. And one thing I wanted from this journey was to try and be a travel writer. That was my sort of pretty delusionary fantasy. So I came home and I wrote my book and I sent it off to all the publishers, and they completely ignored it, and it was a total failure, and no one had any interest in that at all, which of course in itself is not a particularly new experience. Even J.K. Rowling has plenty of stories to tell of being completely rejected by the publishing world. But I decided that I wanted to get my story out somehow, so I decided to self-publish it. And I was quite nervous about doing this. It's quite a vain thing to do, and you risk looking like a real idiot doing this, but I felt that was a risk worth taking rather than getting old and regretting not having done this. And the rewards also seemed worth the risk, the reward of just the pride of having written something that you care about, even if no one else cares about it. And I'm very proud then to have done this, and I've now done 5 books, and which I'm very proud of. They're not exactly Hemingway, but then who on earth is like Hemingway? And I think if you're reluctant to engage in any sort of project unless you're going to be the best person in the world who's ever done this sort of thing, then really very few of us will ever get anything done. You've just got to try and do it as well as you possibly could. And I don't think I would have had the nerve to do that if I hadn't set off on the bike trip and just started to back myself just to sometimes ignore the experts, ignore the conventional wisdom, and just do what your gut tells you. If you're passionate enough about it, just to go with it. And the worst that is probably going to happen is you look like a bit of an idiot, and I can live with that. Since I finished cycling around the world, I've been doing other sorts of expeditions. I've spent the last 5 years training for, preparing for, and being part of a team trying to raise £1 million for an expedition to the South Pole. September last year came. It was the deadline for our fundraising. We didn't have enough money, and we failed 5 years down the drain. And I found that failure and that disappointment pretty hard to deal with. But trying to cope with disappointment is an important thing when you're a solo adventurer, having to pick yourself up. And I realised that although it was disappointing that this journey hadn't happened, there's lots of different routes you can take, lots of courses that can get you towards whatever the dream it is you're chasing. I know when you're wallowing in self-pity, it's hard to realise that there are other routes available, but I managed to perk myself up and thought, I'm not doing this, there must be something else I can do. So having failed to find someone to give me £1 million to go on an Antarctic camping holiday, I stumped up £2,000 of my own money to go on a beach holiday instead. Myself and a friend with a homemade, absolutely terrible shopping trolley of a cart, hauled it for 1,000 miles across the empty quarter desert, which is a wonderful experience, completely different to the South Pole, but it was a great journey, and actually one of my favourite journeys that I've done. I got to film a documentary for myself for the first time. So many good things came out of this journey, and also it's the first time I've ever finished a journey outside a Dolce & Gabbana store in Dubai. So there was a lot of new things to this adventure. In all of the expeditions I've done since cycling around the world, I've deliberately chosen not to focus on one route. So I'm not an expert in anything at all. And I think the only way I make myself just keep trying all these different things that I'm quite rubbish at is by trying to give myself what's known as the permission to continue. It's saying to yourself, I'm not brilliant at this, but that doesn't matter. The main thing is just to get going, build up some momentum, and through time, you'll get better at these sort of things. And I feel that what I try and do is just think of doing what I love doing. And if I keep doing what I love long enough and working hard at it, then eventually I'll get good at it. In all of my plannings for adventures, there was one thing I never wanted to do, and I think with very good reason. I never wanted to row across an ocean. Why? Because I get ridiculously seasick. You're in a very small boat, watching people go to the toilet in very close proximity to you. You do a lot of rowing, you do very little sleeping, you eat disgusting food, you get incredibly big and painful boils on your bottom, which are absolute agony when you sit down, which is quite a problem when you're involved in an activity that involves you sitting down for 12 hours a day rowing. But the opportunity came up for me to row an ocean, so stupidly I said yes, jumped on this boat, and off we went, rowing out of harbour. My mind just filled with all these doubts, thinking, what on earth am I doing? But there's an interesting thing about rowing an ocean, in that essentially you're just a very expensive cork, really, more or less at the mercy of the currents and the winds. And from an hour after leaving harbour, so you row for about an hour, which is quite boring and quite tiring, but you haven't gone very far, you can still see the harbour. You cannot return to that harbour. From an hour into the journey, it's impossible to get that boat back to the start line. So the only possible thing you can do is just keep rowing for 3,000 miles until you get to the other side of the ocean. And what was fascinating about this in my mind was it's very liberating. It completely removes the possibility of failure. And once it's impossible to fail at something, it's very liberating, because then you just think, well, I might as well just keep rowing till we get to the other side. And I realise in the most things that we do in normal life are not quite as drastic as that. But I think if you can try and remove your worrying about failure, and particularly removing in your head, there's the nice temptation of failing, because failing is quite a nice, easy option rather than battling on and on. And what I loved about this ocean rowing experience, which once I got over the weeks of seasickness and the boils on my bottom turned out to be a wonderful experience, was just the fact that I just accepted that we couldn't really fail, more or less, and you just had to keep going, and that was so liberating. And all these expeditions I've been doing over the years teach me all sorts of different things, which I'm so relieved at. I feel so much more of a confident person now than when I began doing them. But I think the main things really are just trying to look positively around me and with curiosity, and to really see that there's adventure everywhere, really. You've just got to go out and find it. And also that it doesn't really matter how small it is, the difficult thing's just beginning on it. And so to try and prove that point, I decided to walk a lap of the M25 motorway. If you can have an adventure walking around the M25, you can have an adventure anywhere. And this was a genuine adventure. It really ticked all of the boxes of big adventure. And I called it my first micro adventure. And these ideas of micro adventure are becoming really important to me. A lot of people can't go and have big adventures. They have 9 to 5 jobs. It's a very valid reason to not be swanning off around the world. But to try and think about it differently, when you leave work at 5 o'clock, what about your 5 to 9? You've got 16 hours of freedom till you need to be back at your desk. So here's an idea. When you leave work, get on a train, out of town, go climb a hill, sleep on the top, sleep under the stars, you wake up with the sunrise, you run back down in the morning, jump in a river, back on the train, back to your desk, 9 o'clock in the morning. A little bit crumpled and dishevelled, perhaps, but just buzzing inside. And I think this concept just opens up so many possibilities. There's 5 to 9 thinking of things. Perhaps you're someone who has absolutely no desire to go and sleep on a hilltop, in which case you are exactly the sort of person who needs to go sleep on a hilltop, by the way. But I accept that not everyone wants to do this, but I think the other way of looking at it is you can look at it as a very cheesy, slightly forced metaphor for life, going to sleep on a hill after work. It's just looking at normal things in a slightly different way, trying to see the opportunities that are out there rather than the obstacles. And also the main thing, I think, is it's about just taking the first tiny little step towards getting you to where wherever you might want to be, in whatever world you're working in. And this idea of micro-adventures has become so important to me, this idea of just trying to take this first little step and then generating some momentum. And for me, this is in a very literal sense of trying to have adventures close to home, or trying to encourage people to have adventures close to home which break the inertia and build up some momentum, which is so important, and which just build up your enthusiasm and your energy and your skills for the bigger projects until you get to the point when you just have to take the plunge and go do something massive and crazy. That's how it is in my world, but I'm sure whatever world you're working in, I think there's a pretty obvious parallel to be taken in that. And I think back now to when I started this whole life of adventure, and the first tiny little step that I took, which was to get on my bike and pedal away from my front door, which are both incredibly small, very easy things to do. And honestly, everything I've done cycling around the world from that point on was very, very easy. And if I can cycle around the world, I promise you anyone can do it. It's really not rocket science. I'm sure you don't want to go cycle around the world, but I want to finish today just by asking you to think about whatever the tiny little first step is that you need to take to get you to be wherever you want to be and whatever your big project is that you're working on or dreaming of, to think what that first tiny little step is, and then to go home today and actually take that first little step. Thank you very much.